Okay, we're going to start now at page 130, and we're going to go to 142. And this little section of part 3, I call it A Tale of Two Sons, but it is basically, we're still at the Scamander River, and it's Priam and Somax getting to know each other, having a conversation, and so at the end of the last section, Priam has done something new, unprecedented. There's so many things he's doing that's new and unprecedented, and from going to ransom his son's body back to going on the cart, the wooden cart, rather than the ceremonial chariot. And he's disposing in many ways of his royal identity in place of the ordinary man. And now one of the things he's doing is chatting. He's asking questions. And as a result of these questions, the following conversation happens. And we learn about Somax's children and the death of his sons. And that is put into direct contrast with Priam's experience as a king and as a father. And so that's the purpose of this next section. We're going to start and follow along. Please take notes, have your pens ready, have your highlighters ready, and everything else. And so here he talks about his family, and Somax says that he's been blessed and then unblessed. This is at the top of 130. All he's got left is his daughter-in-law and his grandchild, his granddaughter, who's a little girl that's 4 years old. And he explains that he's been thinking of her all day because when he left this morning, she had a fever. And he didn't expect to be away for so long. This unexpected thing happened to him too. And a fever is a worry. He expresses how concerned he is about the little 4-year-old, the little granddaughter's body is hot and tossing from side to side and gasping for breath. And a breath, he says, such a simple thing to a man like me. And you wish you could give it to them free. There's a seeing... his grandchild fighting for breath, he would give it up. So we have this sense of this love that Somax holds for his granddaughter, and also the worry. And then he describes his granddaughter, that she's strong, she's full of noise and mischief, that she loves to be swung up on his shoulders and round till they're both dizzy. And you can hear the fondness in the description, this vivid description of his granddaughter. And you see the love that's presented there. And he explains that we're tied, all of us tied, and he indicates his heart. The suggestion is that we're actually all connected through love. And then he tells a little anecdote about his granddaughter, that she once fell in the yard and she bled. And we all got a real fright. He shook all over. He can't bear it if anything happens to this little one, the last of my blood, he says. And he acknowledges the gods had been kind to us by saving him. But the truth is, we don't just lie down and die, do we? We go on for all of our losses. So we see the love and worry he has for his granddaughter. And we also see that perseverance in that we don't just lay down and die, that we go on, that we continue for all of the heartache that we've experienced. And if we turn to page 32, that if anything happened to her, he'd be walking around with a broken heart. His wife gave me 3 sons and 4 daughters, so 7 children. Wow, not one of them is still living. But of them, this is the tale of the two sons. Two of the boys got to be full grown up. The other kids, so we got these stories of the loss, of starvation even. So most of his children, his 7 children, died early. Stomach cramps, fever, fits. One of them couldn't feed. So there's a sense of desperation. There's a sense of poverty and the reality of life that's here. And death. And he remembers the image of his boy. So he's talking about memories of his children when they were young, and he remembers that there's a young girl who couldn't drink milk from mum. She does a very graphic description of his wife's breast swelling. But there was another son, thankfully, who could take the milk, and he remembers that young son and the fact that when one of his children got this milk, the other actually suffered for it. And at top of 133, this one, his daughter, got lost, and the other one prospered and grew up as strong as a bull. The haves, the have-nots, that contrast between, I guess, the unfairness too, that it took one child dying for the other to prosper. And then that strong one, who was strong in his shoulders, was thick. Priam actually asks more questions. He's no longer living, you say. And then Somax describes his death, which was actually his strength, was the death of him. So a neighbour gets his wagon bogged, okay, a drunken fellow, and his son helped him lift it, crawled underneath the wagon, and was trying to raise it on his back when something burst inside him, and he died. Basically, a hero's death, helping a neighbour. And he says he breaks into it. Somax says he breaks into a sweat even now, just at the memory of it. They had to dig him out, and he was half drowned in mud. There's a really graphic description of the death. And the reality, I guess, that pain of life and death. And top of page 134 we are now. And he talks about the loss of his son that leaves a gap you cannot ignore, that's there always. And he remembers his cursing, the song he used to sing. And sometimes Somax thinks that his mother, Somax's wife, his son's mother, died of grief. And even maybe the sense of unfairness about how he died. He didn't have to go under that wagon, except he was just showing off. It was just a young lad's foolishness. Somax remembers knocking him down once. So there's a sense, the bottom of 134, that Somax has regret at smacking or punching his son. So the son answered back and he punched him. He opened his lip with his fist, and he regretted it ever since. He wishes 1,000 times over that he just stood there instead of actually hitting him. But he says, quite philosophically, there's many things we don't know. The worst happens and there it's done. The fleas go on biting, the sun comes up again. That life goes on despite the pain. And then he falls silent. Now Priam starts to reflect here. So page 135, there's a sense of connection that he experiences. He too knows what it's like to lose a son. He's lost so many in the war in these last months and years. He stood beside the body of each one. He poured wine. He sent them with smoking torches down into the underworld, all as the custom and the law demands. So they did the ceremonial burial. So surely he, of all men, knew what it was to lose the son. But he then notices the difference between himself and Somax in terms of how they have spoken, the grief, the reaction to the death. So the way that Somax, the lively manner that Somax has spoken, so full of emotion. Page 136 now. Okay, so in his head, in his mind, the way Somax is retelling the story, he's calling the boy up. He's remembering that cry of a kind he's never heard before or since. The memory of it so present and raw that even in the telling of it, that Priam wondered if the phrase he'd taken up so easily, that he knew what it was to lose a son, really did mean the same for him as it did for the driver. So he acknowledges that his own grief seems pale or insignificant compared to the way that Somax relives his grief. So Priam remembers some of the sons he's lost. And he thinks if any of these losses are in any way comparable to what this man had felt for a boy who was not significant. He was neither a prince nor a warrior, just a villager. And I noticed here the juxtaposition of this royalty and common folk in their reactions. And the relationship here was like formal and symbolic. So for Priam, none of his sons were particular, were special or noteworthy in that way. The relationship he had to them is symbolic. Even here at 136, he could not even be sure of their actual number. He doesn't even know how many sons he actually has. 50, they say? Maybe. So, I mean, I suppose if you've got 50 children, you might lose track of them, but still, it's the significance of that. He doesn't even know his sons. Was it 50? Was it 2 or 3 less? Was it more? And of course, he was the source of their life, so he gave life to them through his manly desire, whether he lay with Hecuba or with his many other wives and concubines. He brought them into being, and he says, well, that was personal enough. And he does have a rush of tender affection for Hecuba, for instance. So he remembers the actual, like the feeling, a warm feeling towards his wives, and he's blessed. But for the offspring of the coupling, which he describes, he doesn't really have any memory of any one of them as a 3-year-old wiping milk from his mouth. So he compares the way that he remembers the childhood of Somax, remembering the childhood of his children, compared to how he remembers it. And he talks about the act of violent intimacy was within his comprehension. So he never knocked any of them to the ground and then hugged his fist and regretted it. Nothing would have permitted such a thing. So he would have had to abandon the austere stance. So that means emotionless. He would have had to give up part of himself, I guess, in order to swing them round and round until they shriek. That's another image that Somax gives of the little girl, the granddaughter. And so in the reflection, he recognized that if he had have done those things, if he had have treated his children in that way, wouldn't he have suffered 20 times over So this love equals suffering. He would have suffered even more if, as he held the brand to the pyre, so as he lit them on fire in their ceremonial funeral, if he had to remember the details, for example. And at the bottom of 139, he talks about this royal custom, the habit of averting his gaze from the unnecessary in particular. The fact that he could actually protect himself with the trappings of royalty protected him and saved him from all of that raw emotion. But at the same time, it was these unnecessary things where pain and pleasure were so mixed that engaged him and moved him. So he recognizes that although he was saved or protected because of his ceremonial self, he was also, he missed out on the pleasure at the same time. And now he's noticing it and being moved by it. And then he asks about the second son. So you spoke of 2 sons that made it to adulthood. And then Somax describes the death of the second son, which happened not 100 paces from here. And he describes that another place down here at the river, not so easy to cross as where we are now, but not so difficult either. And it was Beauty's fault. It's funny, it's his favourite mule, Beauty. And she must have lost her footing halfway across. He was trying to get her upright. Okay? She took panic, knocked him out, and they were both swept out into the stream. So both Beauty and his son were swept into the stream of water. And he rubbed his nose. The sniffing, by the way, the rubbing of his nose, perhaps is also symbolic here. Sniffled. Perhaps grief, perhaps the ordinary life. Yeah, if you Google that, you'll see that there's a number of commentators online who've spoken about the symbolism and the sniffing amongst that. And he then hears a hooting of an owl, and the owl hooting is something that later on we hear as well, represents the presence of the god Hermes, who appears later on. Anyway, we found them in the morning. So Beauty just walked out as easy as you please, never looked back, and she had no idea that she had actually caused the death of his son. Somax felt like punching Beauty, but what would have been the good of that? That would not have brought him back. And there's a maturity a recognition that the desire for revenge is futile. So his son died because of Beauty, but it was unintentional. It was accidental. And so instead of actually punishing and punching Beauty, he ends up taking her head in his arms and sobbing his heart out while hugging his mule. He says it was such a comfort to hold on to her, to feel the warmth against his cheek, and that we're such contrary creatures, because it was grief at his loss and also that Beauty was safe. And now he says, she's all I've got left of him, her, the daughter-in-law, and that little girl. So Beauty and the daughter-in-law and the grandchild. And we're going to stop at that point here, where we're going to go into the next section, which is the arrival of Hermes.